Hello. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What's on Your Mind. So excited to bring this to you another Thursday. And it's actually our last show of Women's History Month. So I'm really excited. My guest with me today is Val West, full name Valdese West. She is the Assistant Policy Scientist for the Institute of Public Administration at the University of Delaware. And if that's not enough, she's also a mediator, a facilitator, and a trainer for conflict resolution programs where she mediates disputes and facilitates challenging meetings. She is a certified mediator, strategic doing practitioner, and is trained in mental health first aid. She is she was recently one of Delaware Times 40 Under 40 and an Innovator honoree for 2023. Val, you do so much. Thank you for taking the time to join me today.
No problem. No problem. Glad to be here.
So before we begin, I know, I went through your title, but can you tell us exactly what your role is in your field?
Oh my gosh, which role and which field? I'm in every, I feel like I put my hands in a lot of different things. Conflict resolution spans across all industries. That's my primary focus, is that I teach, facilitate, mediate conflict resolution. But I also do a lot of different workshops, rather strategic doing, or rather it's just teaching effective communication and other things that kind of fall into that realm. So my title is, like you said, Assistant Policy Scientist, but that's just more so the public administration side. So dealing with local governments and dealing with other elected officials, different things like that is really where that policy scientist piece comes in. And that's also just a way for human resources to kind of make us feel fancy.
Mm-hmm. Now, with that role, you mentioned that you deal with government officials and things like that. Women's History Month, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is I do know that in one of your roles, you spend a lot of times in a predominantly male-dominated industry, correct?
Absolutely.
And so, can you share just a little bit about like some of the unique challenges you face as a woman, especially not just as a woman, but a woman in leadership in a traditionally male-dominated field?
I think that some of the challenges are first just the question of your qualifications, right? Especially when you hear things like public administrator, public administration, people think of public service when they hear women, they think, something like a secretary, a social worker, a nurse, any of those types of roles. And when you hear things like local government, you immediately default to male, those type of situations. So oftentimes when I'm in some of these spaces, it's assumed that I'm there to take notes or that I'm there to support someone else that's there, and not that I can stand independently on my own. So I would say that's one of the challenges, is just the question of if I'm qualified, right? What credentials do you have? Why do you deserve a seat at this table? What do you even know about the topic areas or contents we're talking about? So that's the first challenge. And then I would say the second challenge being that local government can be very strenuous, and not so much of the policy work, right? Because there's elected officials and other individuals that handle that type of work, but just being a person that's in that arena, oftentimes it can get really tumultuous, right? And people are just having these debates and not necessarily wanting to insert yourself in, but being able to be assertive, right? Being able to be direct, being able to be clear. That's another challenge, because of course we know what people like to say about assertive women, right? They like to say that they're angry, they're PMSing, they're this, they're that, all those things, right? And maybe that might be true, but I'm still going to stand my ground and say what I have to say. Mm-hmm. So those are the two challenges that just immediately come to mind for me in that situation.
And like, how do you, like when you encounter those, how do you address them? I mean, especially with people not thinking that you're qualified, because I've been there before, and it definitely ruffles my feathers.
Well, for one, I don't give a lot of energy to people who make those questions, right? Because sometimes people will pose a question to me like, where did you go to school? You don't care where I went to school. You want to know, what are my credentials? Mm-hmm. Like, ask the question you really want to ask. And sometimes I will pose it that way, where I'll say, do you really want to know where I went to school, or do you want to know what degrees I have? Do you want to know what experience I have? Do you want to know what qualifies me to be sitting here with you? If that's the question you want to know, then I'll answer that question, because it's just like when we promote bios and things like that. I don't mind sharing that information. But what I don't do is I don't go head to head with those type of people that make it a point to challenge why I'm there, because I'm giving you way more energy. And I'll tell people in certain situations, especially when I do trainings, if you're not comfortable with me as your trainer, there's the door. And I just make it that simple, because I don't need to prove myself to these individuals in order for them to feel comfortable. But if you're not comfortable, you can always go. because I've already proved myself to the person that hired me to be in this role or to do whatever it is that I'm here to do. But if you're not comfortable with, learning in this environment, then that's your problem. And I make it a point to not make it my problem, right? Because that's what we do. When people make judgments about us or when people pick apart our character, we start making it our problem. Well, what did I do? What is it about me that's problematic? And none of it is problematic, right? Like, I worked hard to get to where I am. So if the issue is that you don't feel comfortable with that, then you can go.
I love that. I wish I had heard that when I was younger, because I do think a lot of us do that. We take it on ourselves. Like, what are we missing? What are we lacking? Not it's that person can't take in what we're providing, and that's really a them problem, not a you problem.
Mhm.
Besides, it sounds like you, for the most part, just take it on head front and you're like, take me as it is. But have you had or found any other strategies that you've found effective when navigating or overcoming like gender biases or stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of that is the trainings that I do, right? And sometimes it could just be small scale, just a few minutes, just explaining to individuals about things like bias. Unless someone's actually told you about bias, you just think it's a way of living. Just the same way, like people say, people that live in a certain area do this, this type of area, people act like that. We just assume that that's just normalcy, and we don't recognize it as bias. And I can say, like, many of us, we learn to listen to, let's say, strong authority figures, deeper voices, clear directives, things like that. And we don't even recognize that sometimes when a sweeter person comes over and they say, "Hey, honey, can you do this thing?" And we're like, whatever, that's a bias, right?
Mhm.
So one technique I can say is just to educate, just to explain that the reasons why you're feeling uncomfortable could be attributed to a bias. And let's talk that out. Let's see what it is that's going on that makes you feel uncomfortable, right? And sometimes it's just discussing like the things that they're recognizing, because I always say that your biggest critics help you to learn to do your craft better. So I always want to hear from everyone who says I'm not qualified, or who they don't say it, right? Like, but anyone who believes that I might not be qualified, for anybody who feels like they're uncomfortable me being their instructor, their teacher, their mediator, their facilitator, etc. I always want to have a conversation and just see why. I mean, they might still leave, but at least I got some feedback that can help me, because there's always going to be another one in
Yeah.
some other session. And so just the education piece is the first thing. But then, like I said, just kind of taking a second to decompress after you have different interactions, and just taking an inventory of your own self and seeing, how do certain things make you feel? Does it make you feel weird when people stare at you? Does it make you feel weird when someone calls you by your full name, right? Because I'm one of those people where if someone mispronounces my name, I'm immediately like, hold on, stop everything, and just recognizing those things internally. So then that way, when I do experience them externally, it doesn't have as much of an impact, because I've already done the inventory and I know these certain things bother me. And I try to proactively make those situations go smoother, so that it doesn't become a problem in every training that I do, right? It might be one person, but it might not be every single training, because I've already addressed it. And then I'm always a person that kind of defaults to humor. I play around a whole lot, but I make it clear, like, the things that we can laugh and joke about, and then the things that are, hey, that's not appropriate. So boundaries are also just as important, right? Like, I will always tell people, we can joke about, clothes, friends, whatever, but when it comes to my credibility, we can't do that. You know, we're not going to joke about anything that could potentially, be misconstrued in my position.
Right, right. And I love that you stand on that. Something that I wanted to mention, because you mentioned implicit biases, which is huge. Actually, there's a couple comments. Charles said some people can't handle your confidence level; they take it as a threat, which is unfortunate but true. Um,
Absolutely.
Izzy said that part. Um, Charles also said, I've dealt with people pronouncing my last name wrong all my life. Yeah, same here, Niwade. I pronounced it wrong for half my life too, so I'm well used to it. But I wanted to talk about implicit bias. I know we're talking about gender and Women's History Month, but race definitely plays a role in it, especially when you're in, certain spaces. And I feel like lately because for a while, right, there was the push for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and let's hire people and do diversity. And then now a lot of companies are like, oh, eyes are off of us. So we're kind of pushing back against that.
Mhm.
We've seen affirmative action be repealed. I don't know if you have been in the news or seen the news lately. There was the unfortunate bridge collapse.
Mhm.
In Baltimore, and the mayor did a press conference, and there's this whole thing because people are calling him a DEI mayor, right? So they're trying to imply that he only received his role as mayor due to DEI, which, hello, it's a voted in role, and most of the city is African American. So even then, it's not like he's the minority. But do you find that taking place within your role? Well, it's a two-part question. So do you find that taking place within your role? And also, have you seen the landscape of that change over like the past year or so, where it seemed like for a while they were more accepting and now they're not, or has it stayed kind of the same?
I think that DEI shows up different ways in different spaces. I am a person that am a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging advocate, cheerleader, instructor, etc. However, I also think that just like anything else in the wrong hands, it becomes the wrong thing. So that's the first thing that I would say. And I think that sometimes we have people that are in leadership that don't necessarily adopt certain principles, but they operate in that way because it's the buzzword, right? It's the thing that's a hot ticket right now. And it's like, we have to seem like we're with it, or else we'll seem like we're being something else. So I can absolutely say that I do see that showing up in different spaces and places that I occupy, both professionally and personally. And then the other piece is that, there are some people that don't understand that diversity is not necessarily this idea that we have to have a different looking person, because I think that teeters into another lane, right? Like, I am very anti-tokenism. I am never for the initiatives that say, hey, you're Black, come here. Hey, you're a woman. Hey, you come here too. Things like that are wrong all the way across the board. And I think that when organizations operate that way, that it does come into question if you're qualified, right? If you should be here, right? Because you weren't just a person that someone actually looked at your resume and said, you're an awesome person, you're good at what you do, you're a content expert, come with me. Someone literally said, hey, we need to make a brochure and we need someone that looks like you. Come on. It becomes it's a very dangerous game. And so I think we see that showing up in society in a lot of different ways, where now people are looking at people and saying, hey, you're in this role. Did you really belong in this role? Should you have been here? And the question becomes, now we want to dig through your past and find some reason why you shouldn't be here. Right. And that's when it becomes a very dangerous game. But when you think about it, it's like you could have used that time, energy, resources, funding for anything else in the world instead of these investigations to basically dismantle the systems of a person that was doing a good job up until you found out that they were a certain way or they looked a certain way. Yeah. And so to me, I just feel like that there are a lot of people that are always going to have problems with people that look differently, that act differently, that speak differently. Like, we could default to like gender and we can default to, race, but there's so many other things, right? Like, there's some people that have issues with people that have a certain size, right? Whether it's smaller, bigger, taller, shorter, like all those types of things, right? Sometimes it's your ability to see and hear, all those different things are things that people use, and then they find out about it and they use it to destruct your character. And that's the unfortunate part. But the benefit for us, though, is that we can arm ourselves with the knowledge that we are credible, that we are worthy, that we are valuable, that we do not have to subscribe to other people's views of us. And so I hope I answered your question. I believe I did, but if you need me to expand more, just let me know.
No, that was great. And I love that answer. And I also want to say, like something that really drew me to you, that I liked about you so much the first time that we met. You were talking, she spoke at a workshop I had for colored girls who have considered corporate America. She's wonderful, sharing her knowledge and thoughts with us. And something she said that really stood out is that she always shows up as herself. Like, she doesn't try to tame herself down or try to fit into what other people think she should be. She just is her, right? And so I love that about you. And I think like that in and of itself is a form of advocacy for whether it's your gender or your race or whatever. So just showing up wholly as yourself is a form of advocacy. Do you have any other ways that like you personally within like your organization at work do advocacy for that level of like equality, whether it's out loud or quiet?
Yeah, well, first I would say, yes, I'm always going to show up as myself. You're going to get all of this, all of it. And like I said, if people can't handle whatever that is, then that is their problem. But I will say that sometimes it's not even like necessarily, because sometimes we can think of advocacy or activism in these like taking down the man, right? Like, I want to dismantle the machine. I want to rage against the machine. We kind of operate in that way, which isn't always effective. But sometimes it could be something like awareness. Like, I know like last year we did a bunch of different events that were very like small. Like, we did Rock Your Socks for Down Syndrome Awareness Day, right? Bringing awareness to different, whether it's something that's physical, mental, just, I think humanizing people is one thing that I think that I try to do in my day-to-day life. Just recognizing different people we swing from a spectrum of physical ability, mental ability, and that's from day to day, minute to minute. And just trying to kind of bring that awareness that could happen to anybody. When we hear about these different stories of people who, got into some type of an accident or some other like life altering illness, that could be any of us. And so we have to recognize that we are literally 1 minute or one, second away from being in a totally different situation. So just having some of those conversations, again, not to necessarily fault anyone, but just saying that, hey, we have to bring some empathy and sympathy into the world because we literally could be there. And I always tell people, the day that my badge don't work, I'm going back home. So I could, I could be a person that's in a totally different situation just from something that, I interpreted differently at work, right? We could go from being employed to unemployed, able-bodied to not able-bodied, mentally well to not mentally well so quickly. And we never know what's going to send us to that point. So I think just kind of being human about it and just recognizing that we all have faults, we all have issues. No one's better than anyone. We just all experience things very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when you talk about, and Charles said, I agree, sometimes the wrong people are put in positions because of DEI. Yeah, that's unfortunate. It's one of those things that I go back and forth on because I'm also very like pro affirmative action, pro DEI, because I do feel like a lot of times very qualified people are passed over for opportunities because of those reasons. But then at the same time, there's also been examples of the wrong people getting those positions because of it as well. So it's very individual. And yes, as you said, things can change for you in a blink of an eye, and that's absolutely true. And you talked about humanizing things, which I think is important, especially because we are human. So I feel like a lot of times while we're navigating these spaces, especially like in corporate or, where you work in government, it's a lot, right? Like we are taking on our jobs, but then all of the undercurrents of what we do. So how do you like prioritize self-care and maintain your resilience as you're dealing with some of those like systemic inequalities and like different microaggressions that you might face?
Well, I tried to, recognize different situations, meetings, or engagements, I should probably say, that could potentially be triggering. And I say that to say, not necessarily triggering in a bad way, because we always think of triggering like an intense negative emotion, but you could be overwhelmed with a lot of positivity and that could cause you to be, triggered as well, right? And we all know about like imposter syndrome and people telling you great accolades about yourself and you're like, no, that's not me. So one thing that I would say is that I try to like scan my calendar. I try to be aware of different situations that could potentially cause some increased feelings, rather positive or negative. So that's the first thing that I do, and just trying to prepare myself for whatever I believe could potentially happen in that situation. And then I also try to take time to decompress in between meetings, because we always have like the meeting to meeting. I'm jumping on this next meeting. And I try my best as much as possible to try to schedule some buffer time. Go get a glass of water. Go just take a walk down the hallway or outside. Breathe some air that's not like business air. That's what I call it sometimes. Like open the door and go outside and just like renew yourself and just like change gears for a second. And I think that that's the biggest thing, is that sometimes we're in this space and then like we kind of default sometimes to like venting and decompressing with other people that are experiencing it with us. Sometimes you got to step away from that and you got to resist the urge to, when you get off of a meeting, talking to your coworker and saying, can you believe that meeting? That was a mess. Sometimes you just got to take the time on your own to process it, because other people can compound your feelings, and rather intentionally or not, like you're feeling something, they're upset, you're both at the water cooler, you're both like, man, forget this job. Next thing you know, it escalates into something that didn't need to. So I would say that taking that time after any type of engagement, especially when it's high emotion, when people are like, rather they're vocal about it, or sometimes you can walk in the room and you're like, oh, this is so tense. What's going on? Yeah. Just taking that time to just like make sure that you're coming down and bring yourself back down to your own baseline, whatever that looks like for you. And then being able to like, again, recognize that a lot of those microaggressions and things like that, or like one of my friends just said in the comments, it's more of a reflection of somebody else's insecurity and their lack of ability to handle your confidence, your abilities, your strengths, right? Like it's not even so much about what they view you as, but it's you internalizing it, right? So when we talk about self-care, it's prioritizing self-preservation, being able to handle yourself with yourself. Like forget everybody else, nobody else is in the room, nobody sees it, there's no cameras on. How am I maintaining myself? So I try to schedule self-care time, self-care days. My kids think I'm nuts because sometimes I'll just sit in here and I'll get dressed up. Like when I say dressed up, I got on some type of a gown. I got on, some little high heels, and I'm traipsing my little self to the dining room table. I'm having a glass of wine, maybe a glass of water, whatever. I might have both depending on the day, listening to music, and I'm just being still.
Yeah.
And I highly recommend everybody find a still thing that they enjoy doing, because that's where your self-care is going to come from, right? And your self-care cannot be tied to another thing or another person, because oftentimes we say, oh, I take care of kids, that's my self-care. No, baby, it's not. And we have to resist the urge. We can't say cleaning out the garage is our self-care. No, honey, it's not. When we fill our lives with that productivity, it gives us these metrics, these unspoken metrics in our head to measure ourselves by. Because then we say, oh, I'm caring for myself, but then when I didn't do what I said I was going to do, now I'm feeling bad, right? So now it has this opposite impact on us. And so we just got to be very careful to just find something that doesn't equate to productivity to use as self-care.
That's definitely great advice. Izzy said it was a great question. Self-care is very important. It helps to not burn out quickly or even worse. I agree. I agree. Now, something that you mentioned was, sometimes you're in meetings and there's emotions that are high. There's, some drama going down, and I'm sure you deal with a lot of that as in your area of dealing with conflict resolution. So I wanted to just ask a few questions around that. The first one being like, is there a common source of conflicts that you find that you encounter in your role as a resolution specialist?
I would say that unspoken underlying need, those things that we never want to admit to other people, when we're in high conflict, it just comes out. So I can say, not too long ago, I was in a mediation and a young lady said, like, my cat just died. And she just like blurted it out and had nothing to do with anything else that we were talking about in the mediation. But at that moment, she was so upset that along with the other frustrations that she was venting, this other thing came out too. So to answer your question, yes, it comes out all the time because we can't control it. You bottle it, you bottle it, you bottle it. At some point, we know when you shake the bottle, what happens? It explodes.
Yeah.
And so when we're in these situations, when somebody gets the opportunity to vocalize, they don't often know how to filter what comes out. And oftentimes it's, you don't need to, but we feel like we have to, right? Like we feel like we have to keep things bottled, don't share with anybody, don't share with these people. But then in the most unsuspecting moment, it comes out. And so typically in these situations, it comes out in a way that where people, and that could also induce conflict, right? Like saying something where somebody feels like it's irrelevant. They're like, that has nothing to do with anything. And so then that can create a whole nother cycle, right? Because oftentimes when these things come out, someone just wants you to acknowledge it. And so in that moment, I just said, okay, do you want to talk about it? She talked about her cat dying for about 2 minutes, 3 minutes. We moved on, and oftentimes that's what happens. It's that someone needs to say it to somebody. And we say it a lot of times in customer service, right? You're the first person that answers the phone. You're talking about somebody's visa bill. They're talking about the kids, the husband, the next door neighbor, and every other thing, because you're the first person that's actually given them that space to articulate what's going on with them. And so that's exactly what happens. We talk about it to whoever is going to listen. And so that's one thing that I strongly believe is that whenever you give people the place to speak, they will speak.
Now, the other side of speaking, like you said, people want to be heard. And I think a phrase that many people or some people may have heard of is active listening. And I think that that's key in those types of situations. How do you ensure, well, first of all, can you explain active listening to anyone who may not know? And then also, like, how do you ensure that the different parties involved feel heard and understood?
So you really just kind of explain what active listening is in its basic form. Active listening is not just to hear the words, but to listen to understand the meaning behind it. It's to understand the feelings, to understand the experience, like not to agree with it, because that's where sometimes people get mixed up. You don't necessarily have to agree, but it's that you're acknowledging that this experience happened to this person and it impacted them in that way. And you're giving them the space and the time to articulate it in the ways that they feel necessary. So we might have our own views, right, about how an experience might have impacted somebody, whether it's because of we've had that experience or just because of our own biases, thoughts, preconceived notions, but giving that person the opportunity to explain literally how it felt for them and what it looks like for them. And that's really what active listening is just creating that space and listening to understand.
And, within those sessions, there's the listening and the speaking, but I would imagine that a lot of times when people go into it, it's probably almost like a therapist, like they don't want to talk about it. So, how do you establish that like trust and rapport with them when they come in, so that it allows you the space to facilitate that communication that's needed?
So when I do mediations, the first thing that I do is I'm very aware of the space that we're in. One thing that we're taught is that we're taught to be aware of proximity, right? Like we never want to be too close to one party versus the other. So you have to think about how your room is set up or how your space is set up. How many chairs are they? Is there a round table versus a square table? Are you at the head of the table or are you at the side? Those types of things are things that you got to think about because people do view things very differently, right? Like if you're sitting at the head of the table, some people are like, oh, you're the boss. No, I'm not the boss. This is your process. So being aware of where people are seated in relation to you is a big piece of being able to build that trust. Making sure that you're being equal. And what I say by that meaning is if you nod with one person, you sure as heck better nod with this other person. And I'm a nodder, right? Like, and I'm not always agreeing with what you're saying, but I'm acknowledging that I hear you by nodding. And so I'm always very aware that if I'm nodding with this person, I got to turn my head and make sure I'm nodding with that person. And I say that along with your other body language, right? Like, are you turned your body to this person and your back is to this other person? Things like that can like unintentionally break down trust. And then making sure that you're giving people the opportunity to say what they need to say, but then setting the ground rules. That's the first thing that's really important, is setting ground rules that everyone agrees to. And just asking them, like, I always have my standard ground rules, things like turning your phone on silent, letting us know if you have any needs for breaks or things like that. Not having side conversations, certain things like that are just kind of like the lay of the land, but then getting their buy-in to say, is there anything else that we don't have? And then a lot of times I'll tell you, can we have no interrupting? Can we have no yelling? Can we have no curse words? Can we have, things like that? And letting them tell you the environment that they want to be in that will have the most fruitful conversation. And things like that really are what builds the trust. Because I always tell people, it's not my process. It's not my thing. It's theirs. And so it should never be how I feel comfortable. It should be what makes you feel comfortable. And then also in that same token, recognizing that some people, even when everything is going well, are just overwhelmed by the process itself and they want to stop. And I think that it's always important to allow people to know that you can stop at any time in any mediation and that it's a voluntary process that you don't have to be a part of. And so I think just letting people know that makes them feel a little bit more comfortable, because in comparison to like some other legal processes and things where you don't necessarily have the option of just leave, I let people know, like, you are not forced to stay, and then if you want to continue this another time, if you want to break, those choices are yours. So I think just letting people know what their options are helps to build trust. And then also, paraphrasing, right? Like telling people what I hear you saying is, and then naming the exact emotion that they said, not changing it, not saying something different, not coming up with my own conclusions. And then asking questions when I feel like it may not be clear, right? Like, but if the other person seems to understand, then I'm not pushing back, right? So another thing that I say about mediation is that you don't create problems that aren't there. So if this person says, I want to take him out every single day for brunch, and we're going to go to the Hotel DuPont, I might say in my brain, like, that's too expensive. But it's not for me to bring that up, right? Like, it's not up for me to say, do you think that's too expensive to do that? If they're both okay with it, you let it go, right? Like, you have to leave it alone. And that's the biggest piece when it comes to creating these fruitful conversations, is just knowing that it's not about you. Letting them, create the trust, but you're just being there to kind of supply the platform.
Now, I have to imagine that in these situations, sometimes tempers flare, people get emotional. How do you manage that? Like when things kind of get out of control, to sort of bring it back to a state of calm so you can have a constructive conversation?
Well, I'll say, for one, silence is a good thing. Sometimes when people get really flared up, especially when they're in these type of like mediations, and it even happens in training sometimes where people kind of go at it. And sometimes I'll just sit there and I'll just wait. And, sometimes that in itself can kind of diffuse a lot. Sometimes we feel like we want to jump in and say something, but sometimes people just kind of have to just kind of process in their own time with no sound, nothing happening, so then they can kind of reflect on what they said, because sometimes we're not even thinking about what we say. We just like fire off, right? And we're just going back and forth. But sometimes after a second, you're like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe this wasn't the right time for that. Maybe I went too far. So that silence kind of buys a little bit of that time to be able to do some of that. The other thing that you can do, if it is something where people are constantly escalating, I would just say, we just have to remind ourselves of our ground rules, and sometimes I might put like my hand in the air like this, and I'll just say, friends, I'm a friend person. I will friend the heck out of everybody. I'm like, friends, hold on, friends. We still have to remind ourselves of our ground rules. And then I'll repeat them. If I feel like that there are certain rules that they need to remember, I'll repeat all of them. And I'll just say, hey, remember we said that we were going to do this. We agreed to do this. We agreed to do that. Is that still working for us?
Right.
And things like that. And I'll just check in and say, hey, is there anything that we need to add? Because I want to make sure that we're having fruitful conversation. And I'll just remind them of things like that. And because, like I said, it's voluntary, right? So I never want to come off like I'm trying to order people around. I'm just trying to see what makes sense for the people that are involved. And sometimes I'll say, I know we said no interrupting, but can we say, and they'll tell you exactly what they need to have the different conversations. And we have to also be recognize like the dynamics, right? Like family members have different dynamics than neighbors do.
Right.
Just like coworkers have different dynamics than, a supervisor and a subordinate. So we have to be mindful of like the power dynamics. And we also just have to be mindful of making sure that some people aren't shrinking down, because sometimes when things escalate, people will retreat and they'll kind of put their head down and they'll, and just making sure that we're kind of checking in and saying, hey, is everything still okay? You still okay to continue? Things like that. They just kind of help, to kind of, because sometimes people will say, and then I'll go back to the person who was escalated and just say, hey, is everything okay with you? And oftentimes just giving them that opportunity to just kind of stop for a second and reflect. Or I'll say, you gave a whole lot of points. Is there anything else that you want to add that you felt like wasn't said before? And something that's open-ended where they get the opportunity to just kind of like reflect. I think sometimes we say yes or no. People can kind of just immediately respond without actually understanding the question. But open-ended questions kind of help them to process. And then, like I said, kind of slow themselves down and decompress on their own.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And you mentioned, having the different dynamics is knowing those is very important. In the chat, Charles said that you're around your coworkers more than your family, which is absolutely true for the most part. Izzy said, I feel like these techniques can be used in everyday life. Completely, definitely agree. Charles said, great conversations. Thank you. And thank you, Keith London, for tuning in. And Charles said, establish those rules before the conversation. I agree. And I mean, tying that in with what Izzy said about real life, like I usually start, especially certain situations, with questions. I think that that's good to establish like what's the intent of the conversation and where are we going? Are we trying to problem solve or are we just trying to be heard? Because I think that a lot of times is not knowing sort of that end game, that end goal, creates more strife sometimes.
Oh yeah, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think I would just add that in itself, like people don't think that they can establish rules for how people engage with them, and you can, right? Like I tell people all the time, do not call me before 10 o'clock a.m. Like unless it's truly an emergency, like not like somebody is like thinking that they're going to do whatever. No, I need to know that they're doing it. They're on the way. Like I need to know what's happening at this moment, because that's the time that I make for myself, and that's the time where, like I think I had mentioned earlier, I like to engage with people, but you have to be aware of things that could potentially be, escalate or could take you to a place that you don't want to be. And I think that it's okay to ask someone when they want to have a communication with you, okay, what are you looking for? Like you said, what's the purpose of this? Are we trying to rebuild the relationship? Are we trying to fact find, right? Like, are you asking me questions that you want answers to? Or because all those different things would tell you if you even want to participate in those conversations. Yeah. And I often tell people the biggest piece of communication is understanding that some people don't have to communicate with you. And I think that as a people, we want to say, oh, it's respect and this and this. Sometimes their version of respect is by not talking to you. Because if they do, they're going to tell you, your mom, your grandmom, all your descendants, and you don't want that, right? And they don't want that. So sometimes they're just like, okay, I'm just going to not talk to you at all. So we don't have to go there. And we have to respect that's their decision.
Yep.
And we don't want to, right? Especially as adults, we're like, no, you need to talk to me. No, you don't have to. And what do you really gain from talking to someone who doesn't want to talk to you? And that's what we have to remember, is that purpose does matter. Are you just wanting to talk to me just for the sake of saying you talked to me, just for saying that we did it? That's not really productive. And we don't want non-productive conversations. We want things that are going to help, something to grow. We want clarity. We want understanding. We want those types of things. And sometimes that conversation could just be, I thought we were, going to have more of a friendship, but I think I might have to scale back. I think I can't communicate with you as much. I can't spend as much time with you. And, things like that. And so I think that when we're talking about those boundaries in that communication, just understand that you set your own rules for your own communications.
Yeah. Yeah. And establishing those, he said establishing boundaries. And that is huge. That is my word for the year. Just with work and personal. I'm definitely one of those people, like if I'm upset, we can't talk. Like, because first of all, I'm going to cry. Not because I'm sad, because I'm trying so hard not to kill you, and
Right.
it's going to make me cry. And then also because I don't ever want to say things I regret. Like, I have no problems apologizing when I do something wrong, but I can't stand when someone else does something wrong, and then my reaction to it now leads me in a spot where I have to now apologize for how I reacted. So I'm like, I'd rather take a step back so I can calm down and we can have a rational conversation. And I find, unfortunately, sometimes some people, they aren't okay with that. Like, they want to talk about it right then and there. And I'm just like, I don't understand what the problem is. It's wanting that space, like want
Hmm.
that breath before you get into it. I feel like it just is better for communication purposes. Like you said, that silence, importing that silence in there to bring things back to zero, I think is very important. Now, we mentioned some of these conflict resolution skills are good for real life. One that I would love to know is, what are some things, like when you're thinking of the actual resolution portion of it, right? Like, you're wrapping up. What are some things that you employ to prevent them from reoccurring, or to ensure like a long-term reconciliation? Is there certain things that you do, or like points that you keep mind of, or to find that ground for, to prevent this from happening again, that people could also use in real life?
So I would say, I mean, in the mediator space, sometimes we do have agreements, and it could be something as simple as you said you would mow the lawn Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. I said I would mow the lawn Monday, Thursday and Friday. So sometimes it could be things like that because oftentimes people do like things to be documented.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one technique that's always available. And I often tell people that we do those type of contracts in our regular day-to-day conversations, right? Like we'll say, how come you didn't do X, Y, and Z to our coworkers? And they'll say, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to. And then you say, well, per our conversation, right? We all have sent those emails where we say, per our conversation, I'm understanding you will do X and I'm understanding that I will do Y. So sometimes that documentation piece is just enough for some individuals. Um, but then when you do lay out whatever it is that you guys are agreeing to, I'm always very careful to not say, so it sounds like you agree to, I'll say, so is there something that would work for you in this situation? And then let the person say what that sounds like. And then say, does
Mm-hmm.
that also work for you? And then letting them talk about what works and doesn't work. And then, forcing them to kind of be specific, okay, you're going to mow the lawn on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. At what time? Who's going to supply the lawnmower? You know, like things like that, because those are the things that would essentially come up later on. So to your question about recurring, a lot of times the recurring piece is because we didn't understand what was expected of us to begin with. So I
Mm-hmm.
would say outlining those expectations on both sides and then laying out who's responsible for what and when. When are they going to do it? What are they going to do? Who's going to supply the things for them to do it? And if it doesn't work out because someone's sick, or they're out of town, what is the alternative? What's the contingency plan if this thing can't work out? And
Mm-hmm.
just having them lay out all those different scenarios. And of course, we don't want to say, hey, if you're in Vegas for 6 months, what are you guys going to do? But we do want to say things like, if someone's unavailable, who could do this thing? And what exactly is the problem? Is the problem the grass? Is the problem, like, would you guys get a landscaping company? Like, who's going to pay for that? Like things like that. And just force them to go each layer deeper and deeper and deeper to the point where everybody's like, I'm okay. Okay, that's cool. Because a lot of times, like I said, it's a process, right? So people will tell you when it's enough. They're like, we're good with this. And sometimes it could just be just the schedule. Some people are just like, I'm gonna mow the grass and they're gonna mow the grass. Okay, what days? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday. All right, you good? You good? All right, cool. We're done. And then, but when you see, and a lot of it is like the people reading thing, like where you're watching people, you're watching their reactions, you're watching their expressions. Sometimes they're like, and you're like, is there anything further we need to discuss? And
Right.
then I was like, yeah, I don't really know if I'm going to have the money to pay for a landscaper. Okay, so let's talk about that. And just kind of bringing it back. And sometimes it can feel like a cycle. It can feel like you're just kind of like going over the same things over and over. But I promise you, every time you go through the conversation again, you'll get more information. Somebody will tell you something where they say, well, you know what? Actually, my aunt has a landscaping company. We could probably tap into that. Oh, I didn't know that. And then allowing them to kind of enter more and more information into the conversation. But again, letting it be their process.
I love that. And I love too that you mentioned, like, having, like, instead of you telling them, what the resolution is, having them tell it back to you what they heard. Because I feel like that's important in the end beginning of conversations. Like, there's so many times, and this is something that I went through with my therapist, and she really taught me the importance of asking, like, what did you hear me say? Like, or is that what
Mhm.
you heard? Because there are so many times where like you think you heard the person, but when you repeat it back to them, or when they repeat back to you what you said, you're like, no, that's actually not what I said.
Mhm.
And if you already are starting on that ground of not knowing where you're at, like it's not going to be a productive conversation. So obviously having you as a conflict resolution specialist, like you're able to help that because you're going to have that conversation of clarifying things before moving on. But I think it's important for people in their everyday conversation, especially with a potential conflict situation, to repeat back what you think you heard or have them repeat it to you just to make sure that you're starting that conversation in a way that you're on the same page, and then like you said, ending it that way as well, making sure
Mhm.
you're ending it on the same way as well also. Charles said three-part communication is very important at times. Yes. And and then the last thing that I just wanted to ask is just just bringing it back full circle. We were talking about gender and race and things like that. In what ways do you think like cultural differences or diversity among the parties that you interact with, does that impact your approach to problem resolution? Does it create another level of complexity that you then have to navigate through?
Absolutely. And I know when I first started doing conflict resolution years ago, I remember so I was trained by attorneys and judges, first of all. So I have to put that out there, which the way that they handle conflict resolution is a little different because it's very logical, right? And so it's kind of like, what are the policies? What are the procedures? What are the rules? But then you have to take into account that everybody interprets things very differently. So that's the other piece. So I would say that cultural differences definitely come into play because we learn from the environments that we're in. We learn, like when people say right or wrong, we learn right or wrong because someone told us that when we did this thing, that it was wrong, right?
Mhm.
That's how we learn. More often than not, it's by us seeing different people punished by certain things that even if we didn't do it ourselves, we now interpret that behavior as something that's wrong. So culture absolutely has a lot to do with the work that I do. And it also has to do with the conversations that we have because certain things like right, wrong, those things are subjective and it's dependent on the person who's, articulating it. So a lot of that is literally conflict resolution where, I will say to someone, for instance, they'll say, well, they should have known. That's another thing.
Mhm.
And culture is another, should have known is reflective of someone's culture, right?
Right.
And one of the ways that I can say that a lot of people see this show up in their workplaces is like, have you ever worked in a place where they say you can't heat up seafood in the microwave or you can't
Mhm.
pop popcorn, you know, and like either there's a sign or even if there's not a sign, everybody knows it, or
Right.
everybody has their own certain parking spots, or we put certain things on certain shelves in the refrigerator, like that's my spot, that's your spot, that type of thing, right? That those all those different things are cultures. And we have to remember that culture is literally just how a group of people operate. I mean, it's way deeper than that, but on its basic level, that's really what a culture is.
Yeah.
And that shows up in the engagement that we have because then we try to tell other people this is the way that you should function. And they're like, wait a minute. At my last job, I pop popcorn every day. I had seafood every night. I don't know what the problem is. Right. So then when you have those different clashes, it's oftentimes because of those beliefs and those values that are ingrained in the cultures. And we always just kind of have to be mindful of the fact that we never know, right? Like even things like eye contact, even shaking hands, they show up differently in different cultures. And
Yeah.
we also know that COVID has changed all of that for all of us. Well, most of us, like we're shaking hands when we went into a meeting was the standard. And a lot of people were like, nope, don't touch me ever. I'd see you from over here. That's cool. And some of those things have shifted based off of like the culture of COVID. But just recognizing that all those different things show up differently gives us more of an opportunity to explain what that looks like for us.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's amazing, and thank you for explaining that. Izzy said, "Love the way you broke that down." So true. It is absolutely. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. You're such a wealth of knowledge. I appreciate any time I get to talk to you and soak some of that in. If anyone wants to get in contact with you, I know you also do. Besides that work, you do conflict resolution trainings and things other places. So, if anyone wants to get a hold of you, how can they reach you?
Trust me, with a name like Valdese, I can't hide, but you can find me on Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at University of Delaware's website.
Perfect, perfect. Well, thank you again so much for joining me, Val, and thank you everybody who joined me from home. We will be back next month. It is April, and we are kicking off the month with a conversation with Pastor Fred Hanna about the relationship between religion and mental health. So please, which is a topic very close to my heart. So please join us again next Thursday at 6 p.m. Thank you.